today, kicking off our lecture series, we're very happy to have back with us BD Wortham Galvin. BD is perhaps the only student that we've had here at the University of Maryland who received tenure as a student. She was here for a long time as a student, and we actually felt that she was a faculty colleague even before she graduated as a student. She was teaching us so much and really gave us a great perspective on who we were as colleagues. Eventually, BD came back and taught with us for a number of years, straddling between the architecture program and the historic preservation program, two of her main interests. BD has degrees from, if I get this correct now, from Brown, from Penn, from the University of Maryland. Am I leaving something out? And MIT, I'm sorry, and MIT. My goodness.
This is the only place with a decent football team.
Well, there you go. And so there it is. And her lecture tonight, the title is Behind the Architecture as a Verb. Design practice is cultural practice, I think will challenge us in terms of how we think about design. We're so happy to have you back here in the nice and cool and temperate Washington area. BD has relocated herself to Portland, a city that I understand has a terrible climate and has people that are just angry at one another walking around, and no TV shows made about the place at all. So there you are. BD, welcome back.
We're doing it. This is like the Titanic. Is this one?
And then that should be. Yeah.
So I'd like to start with a statement and a question. And they have to do with sort of how I frame both my own approach to architecture as well as how I engage students. So the statement is that architecture is not about buildings, it's about people. And the question is, who makes place and who gets to occupy them? So that's what I want to talk about, and I'm going to frame it in this conceptualization of architecture as a verb. And this is for you, Steve. I don't know where you're sitting here. But my own love of Corbusier came from our own Steve Hurt, so there you go. This is architecture as a noun. So, and I'm using the thing that I think, in my mind, makes the most sense, the Vitruvian triad, commodity, firmness, and delight, as a way to understand architecture as a noun. That if you do these three things well, which Corbusier did, then you have achieved a skilled manipulation of form and space. I happen to put commodity a little bit bigger here because that's about well-composed forms and spaces, the development of program, maybe integrating systems within the building, but Corbusier is doing both. Nevertheless, the fixation of architectural practice with the celebration and/or commodification of aesthetic genius in both the 20th and 21st centuries has supported an emphasis on the architect really as this reified author of the artistic object, rather than as a facilitator of cultural practice. Right? And many people, this is not just a Corbusier thing. I highlighted firmness here because to me these are really skilled manipulations of form and space that have a focus either on the use of materials or on the structural soundness of the building. But again, more of this formation of architecture as the noun. And then we'll get to the final one, delight. With delight, we get to enter discussions of beauty. It's really the aesthetic will of the architect through, again, the manipulation of form and space. And obviously we could have a whole separate lecture about the issue of beauty or delight for my daughter that you see here. If the building is pink, that is a beautiful building. So so we took her to the EMP project up in Seattle, and you could tell she was really excited that building was pink. But I will Google image Varagon or Legaretta, and she loves them too because they do a lot of pink buildings. So if you don't know who they are, then you gotta go back to your history class. What I really am interested in, though, is this different version, architecture the verb, right? Which is not about the building as a static object or about the architect as sort of this genius form giver. Is it possible for an architectural verb to counter notions of cultural commodification? In other words, that we consume buildings, right? That's the culture that we've been living in for the past couple of decades. Or counter notions of the aesthetic genius of the architect. In search of extending architecture culture to those people and those places left out or behind of architectural design and development decisions. If so, how does a shift from a noun-based architecture to a verb-based architecture allow one to interrogate the following issues? 1, how space constructs a particular worldview for ourselves. 2, how the discipline of architecture has passed on a very specific worldview. And 3, how the profession has embedded that worldview within the built environment. So this is Walter Hood. I consider him an example of a practitioner who engages architecture as a verb. And his early work that sort of put him on the map back in the 90s was a monograph that you can find up in the library called Urban Diaries. And in Urban Diaries, he was particularly interested in these pocket parks in Oakland that had become derelict, that were hostile places, places of crime. But what he was uncomfortable with was the approach that, well, if you take the homeless or the vagrants or the prostitutes or the alcoholics, whoever these people are that are somehow making this space hostile, and just move them somewhere else, then we get a good space. He said, no, let's actually look at what they do and what they need to, in fact, rethink how the park might accommodate various people, help them make their lives better, but not just move them into a different neighborhood, right, to make that somebody else's problem. So his Urban Diaries really study what is happening in a space, and how do we accommodate, how do we make the space better, but how do we also accommodate those people that are already there and make their lives better as well, instead of just trying to shove them off into a new neighborhood. Architect Craig Wilkins has also crafted a conceptualization of architecture as both a noun and a verb in addressing the omission of African Americans both from practice and the disciplinary thinking of architecture. For Wilkins, and this is his quote, the static, concretized understanding of architecture as a noun keeps it from changing with the demands of a multicultural society. So here's a different version of architecture in the verb. And I'm going to quote Wilkins again. When architecture is examined as an action, state, or motion, it opens up other possibilities for our shared environment that present more fluid, inclusive, and mobile manners of engaging with the environment. So, architecture the verb does not throw out the Vitruvian triad. It's still about commodity, fitness, and delight. But whereas architecture the noun uses the manipulation of form and space to achieve those three things, architecture the verb uses time, a sense of the temporal, as well as the issue of co-production as equal actors to form and space. We're not getting rid of form and space, we're just adding to it. Right? So time, co-production, and that those two things are going to deliver some type of form and space resolution. Field operations highlight, I think, is a great example of this. I'm only giving you, I'm going to be so excited that we have a low-tech version. I carry a big stick. So I purposely just gave you sort of the small perspective of it, because I'm more interested in these as design drawings, right? The bottom two really focusing on issues of time and how that's going to impact the design and the experience of the place, that is part of the palette and tool that the designer uses. And the top is part of what I'm calling co-production, which is you take a type, in this case they're calling it the peel-up typology, but then you start to see how it can be manipulated for a variety of uses. The final example I want to show you before I get to the three main case studies, just to sort of tease out this notion of architecture of the verb, is the Astor Gates, who's doing really interesting work on the south side of Chicago, not far from the University of Chicago's campus. So in 2009, he purchased a property. The property next door came viable for purchase as well. So those are these two properties, the archive house and the listening house. He formed a foundation called the Rebuild Foundation. And so he bought more properties, and now there's a cinema house as well. These public buildings provide gathering space and a host of music, movie, cultural activities related to the local populations and their specific ethnic and racial backgrounds. They conduct oral histories. They have an archive particularly focusing on African American culture and ritual. They have this amazing, I don't know if I have it on the inside, album collection, right, of significant jazz and blues artists. So it's become a place where people can go. The Astor Gates, however, did not just sort of build it and they will come in the Field of Dreams model. These projects utilize resources within the community itself. The resources include local labor. It was a design build with the community, all of the buildings that he built. It also used local resources. They salvaged for materials that were within the community itself. And is continuing to rebuild that neighborhood in what has been an underserved and lower income neighborhood that has been marginalized for a long time. And it has now become a highly culturally productive place within these neighborhoods that has become the center of life on this particular South Side neighborhood. So for the rest of the talk, I want to talk about 3 student projects. I manage my time well. Outlining a design pedagogy wherein the notion of the architectural verb takes precedence and informs the architectural noun in the design process. So the premise behind the projects that I'm going to show you, I'll tease you with the first one, is that design practice is cultural practice. And the students involved in these are going to be 3 thesis projects that I'm going to show you. We're particularly interested in challenging the current authority and power of the architect, right? They're about to graduate, they're doing their thesis, and they want to understand what does it mean to be an architect and how might that change in the co-production of place. So this first project is by a student named Chris Klein. The title of his thesis is Creative Common Ground, which you see at the bottom. I'm calling it open source praxis because his use of the open source to me is what's really embedding this in the co-production and architecture as a verb. He was interested in the highway as a type, right? This is a ubiquitous American problem. We build all this highway infrastructure, often in downtowns. Portland has its own. What you see there in blue is the Willamette River, just to give you a general orientation if you don't know Portland. This is sort of the central downtown business district, and then lots of neighborhoods on either side. One of the highways is running around this river here, which you can see maybe a little bit better here, or outlined in yellow there. And he was particularly interested in, look, we're not going to do what Boston did and do the big dig. So how do you turn all these spaces that you see highlighted in yellow that are either parking lots or vagrant areas or where drug deals happen, sort of those types of things, and make these productive places again. He did do some traditional mapping, I think types of exercises that many of you would recognize to understand the current and historical conditions of the site. And I'll just point out a few things. So this is a historical figure ground, so you can see there used to be buildings going right up to the river, and then obviously when we build the highway, we've severed that connection. That also is a typical thing that happens in the US. When he was doing these, I said, okay, you got to do something else. I need you to engage in what I called an interactive making exercise. And that would be this. So he did sort of this photo collage, which you see at the top of the existing conditions under the highway at this particular point. And then just sort of postulated, well, if it was housing or if somehow it was some type of work area or recreation area, what would that just as a collage look like? And then he created this toy where all of those are on there, but he sliced them up so you can spin them. And that particular, let me just go back one. So in terms of the zoning, which you can't tell what it says, which is totally fine, how this area is zoned is for industrial, but they have an overlay zone sort of for creative, so there's lots of web designers, creative types, fabric, but there's no housing. They are purposely not allowing housing in this particular part of Portland because they want it to be light industrial creative maker spaces. And along the river, there actually is an esplanade where you can hike and bike and run and do whatever, but the highway sort of severs those two. So he took the toy both to the esplanade where the people are running and biking, and trust me, it's hard to get the bikers to stop. But he also went to the warehouse buildings that have been reused as some of these design maker spaces, and took it to them and just asked them how they would see that space. And they wouldn't, he said almost no one would turn it into one image, that there would be some kind of mix of recreation and working. This interaction really fired him up, and he wanted to think of a new way in which to think of people as not just users of the public space, but that they would be the makers and instigators of the public space itself. So he did a series of diagrams where he started trying to figure out what would that look like. So in this one, and he was inspired by some tactical urbanism that happens a lot in Portland. Vacant space, a new notion of the public. How can we use the web? How can we use design build? How can we share all of these things that we're doing? How can we adapt and modify them to end up with a public space? So he did a whole series of these as he's just trying to figure out the concept of how is this thing going to work, right? At the top, he's trying to understand what's the role of the public. If the public is not going to be consumers, which is the architecture as a noun model, right? That we consume buildings either visually or in other ways, like as a brand. The public can be designers, they can be builders, they can be the owner-operators, and then there's sort of new public roles for everyday people. Then how is the build process going to work? And so we realized there had to be some type of module, but there also had to be some type of web interface, so that between those two things, there's some kind of kit that you can modify through the web that would eventually show up on the site that you could build, rebuild, and then in the end, because it's open source, share it. So we started working on the web interface and built a whole website around it, trying to understand how it would be a network, how you would manage this process, and what would the architect's role be within that. And here's sort of a zoom in of one of these diagrams that he's doing, right, where he's trying to understand what's the project, what parts of the site are available for you, what's your design assistance, what's the library modules, which I'll show you in a second, how do they get a design review, what's a community forum and review, all of these things he built a website for. The other thing he built were these, and they're actually individual, if you look at them across a horizontal. These were supposed to be little pocket takeaway workbooks about the process, so that anyone literally could engage in the process of design, running across this way. So if you imagine these things being folded, this is the plot, right? You would come out of the printer, and then he cut them up and folded them so that he could hand them out in that district. And they are describing things. Let me find out where I am. Like, how do you deal with leasing and zoning? How do you deal with the democratic review process? How do you fund the project that you want to do? How does the module get delivered? So each one sort of deals with a different aspect that again is oriented towards a lay person. This is an example of, say, first 2 pages of the 6th one down. Right? So he made a website, but he also made these workbooks so to introduce people to it in a low-tech way as well. The other thing he had to do was build a module library. So we started working on what are the basic typologies that are going to work. And again, he didn't want to defy the current zoning, so it didn't deal with housing whatsoever, but tried to deal with small module spaces that people might occupy or that would have to deal with public types of activities. And built, right, their basic construction, how they might be used for various uses from food service to small office, those types of things. And then even developed OMSI as the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, a module workshop that could be held there for people to understand how to build their own modules. So then he never made the website public because he was testing it. He invited some people from this neighborhood. Remember, the neighborhood is an industrial, creative maker neighborhood, so they're not living there, but the people who work there, to come to the website and start to suggest modules that they would like to see. And he would develop some of them so that we would understand how that interface might work. A lot of people wanted to see things happening on the water because there is no access to the river for an extended period of time. He also wanted to figure out how these things might be adaptable, particularly in this diagram is talking about the seasons, right? Portland in the summer is very different than Portland in the fall and winter because of the rain, and how could the modules adapt to time, and he would obviously do renderings to try and figure that out. In addition, he wanted to know, how do we utilize the infrastructure as another resource? So he developed a series of straps and ties and mechanisms so that you could attach things to the structure of the underpass itself, as well as tapping into it as a utility. You know, we have lots of climbers. Cirque du Soleil comes all the time, so that's what the next image is. All right, so I'm trying to figure out if people want this as a climbing space. You know, he sets up this basic system, and he did lots of sort of wall section type detail drawings about how to attach to this, right? And then to figure out how does that space get activated at different times of the year and for different purposes. So how would this process work? That you would go on the web, that on the web you would start to mark suggestions of what you might see happening where, and that depending on the funding and the public will, right, the democratic design process, how many people were interested in those tags, that some of those things would start to get built. Remember, some of those modules might be paths, safe places for people to walk. Some of them might actually be buildings. So you'll see tags showing up, which is actually where they're tagged on the web, and that there would be a building phase where those modules would happen so that people are driving what we want to see happen on the site until eventually it would get built out as a whole neighborhood. We studied two very different conditions on the site because the highway is higher at one and lower at the other. But the same thing, you can see the flags, you know, it's a parking lot, you can see the flags showing up, people expressing interest on what might happen, and he was basically doing the design work of responding to those flags. And I'll just show you some details of that because everything seems so far away, right? Very Portland, safe sleeping. There's a lot of homeless in this area. So again, it was a little bit of Walter Hood philosophy. We're not pushing them out. We're just trying to find better ways for them to occupy the space. Lots of pop-ups, parklets, urban gardens, food carts, very popular, micro business, those types of things. So he was really asking the question, what would you build? And trying to use the role of the architect as one who facilitates that through their design skills and being able to manipulate and provide the design of these various modules, but as an equal partner with the neighborhood instead of treating it as you're the user after I have provided this particular object to you. This is the second student project. This particular project by Nida Amani is called Refugee Camp to City. I call it culturing praxis because in particular she was very much interested in the culture of the refugees from their home countries and what does it mean when they go somewhere else. She was particularly aware of the Syrian uprising and its impacts in terms of the refugee population, which is very topical today because we're seeing that happen all over. And I should say Nida is from Jordan originally, so for her really hit home. And you can see some of the stats. She did a tremendous amount of research, and again, I'm only showing a fraction of the work product, but you can see an astounding number of people. That top number is just the 43 million people are forcibly displaced around the world right now, right? So it's a huge problem, but yet one that we don't often talk about architecturally. If we get down to her focus, right, we have almost 4 million Syrian refugees, 600,000 of them in Jordan, and she was decided to focus on a particular camp, the Zatari camp, which was built to house 60,000 people. This is the current population, and you'll notice about half of them are children. That will become germane in a second. Here's a map of Zatari, and what these are showing it sort of build up over time. And what she's showing here is this is sort of the existing response, which is an emergency response. right? So dwelling units are given to everyone, and some basic infrastructure is put in place, and it's treated as a temporary emergency problem. And yet worldwide, people are spending up to 17 years living in refugee camps. So the approach is one of an emergent temporary situation, and yet they become a permanent place for people to live, right? So there's a dissonance there. The other thing she noted was it was a very military approach, based all the way back on Roman military camps. You'll see in a second, the Cardo Decumanus is going to show up. And so she was interested in the red line represents some of her thoughts, which is, okay, yes, you absolutely have an emergency response. Some of the things running on the side is things like schools and medical. But then when do we get to public space implementation? When do we facilitate jobs and businesses, all of those types of things? In the Zatari camp, it's illegal to hold a job. But, ooh, and I'm getting ahead of myself. But what you're going to see in a second is it doesn't mean that people are trying to find ways. So I told her, based on her particular desires, that it would be really better if she could go there. And I said, but obviously I know that that's a big ask, so you don't have to. But as I said, her family lives in Jordan, so she said, yeah, I can make that happen. I said, well, we still got to, I know you can get to Jordan, but I said, we got to get you to the camp. Her father happened, and I give you this because I don't want you all running out and trying to replicate this. It was sort of a unique situation. Her father's in food services, so had access to trucks that go into the camps to do food distribution. And she worked with the UN to get a pass. So she went in, she did not spend the night, but she went in every day over her winter break to the camps to understand what's happening. She was inspired by Walter Hood's Urban Diaries, in the sense that she wanted to go there, she wanted to journal about it. That's what this next page is. I need to get a higher resolution so I can do a big one. This is low resolution. But she would go every day, and she would draw, and she would make observations and write about them, and she'd take photographs, and when she'd go back home to her parents' home, I said, you got to do it every night, because you got to capture what happened. She would recollage it into a page to understand what's going on in this particular place. So here's it's in red, she loves red, so you can see our Cardo Decumanus in red there. She was, based on her visit, she wanted to focus on, so when I'm saying the Cardo Decumanus, right, it's the big part in red. The shaded area on top just indicates where she spent most of her time during her field work. The first day she went in a car with one of the UN workers through the whole camp, and based on that, decided on foot to focus on this area. This area also is sort of where the camp started, where most of the original people lived. So what's interesting about this red line, where they come together right here, is that all of those caravans that you're seeing her articulate here are illegal. And they're illegal not because they're caravans, they're illegal because they're commercial activities. So what's happening is a grassroots urbanism in the camps. You're given a caravan as your dwelling unit, and that's it. It's illegal to hold a job because the Syrian refugees, there's a lot of conflict within their presence within Jordan. They don't want them taking jobs away from the Jordanians. But that illegal blanket state means that there are 3,000 businesses along the Cardo Decumanus, and they are all illegal. But it's sort of a tacit, they allow them to happen, right? 600 of them are restaurants. I mean, people are trying to build a life. So she became interested, it's a thesis, she can't take on the whole camp because she tried and told her she couldn't, to really focus on this area. The other thing I want to point out here are a few stats. Up here. And I know you can't really read them very well, but these have to do with the things that are available to the children of the camp. Remember, about half the population is children. And in here, what you're seeing, the lighter gray is male children, the darker gray is female children. And this has to do with who attends school. So 58% of the boys are attending school, only 42% of the girls, right? And this is obviously how many are not attending. The other thing that she pointed out, I know that the color becomes confusing here, and I've got on her about that later. This is a comparison between what happens in their home country versus what happens in the camp. So in the home country, a child bride is defined as any female child who gets married before the age of 18. 13% of girls will become child brides. In the camp, 46% of girls will become child brides. right? So that stat was very concerning to her. And she decided that she really wanted to, in addition to focusing on the Carta Decimalis, she wanted to focus on children. She wanted to focus on the unit of the caravan as her material palette because that's what's available. But she wasn't going to design and build something with materials that could not be had on site. She wanted to sort of use that boundary to make it realistic. And she also wanted to focus on notions of one's relationship to the public realm. So here's so the other thing that's interesting, the numbers on here correspond to this. And what this is as a diagram, you're given a basic caravan. These are the various ways in which the refugees are already tactically adapting their caravans, right? And then she would note how she saw that particular adaptation along the Carta Decimalis. The other thing that I will say is that she had a series of these because these are temporary. In other words, these businesses are illegal. They shut them down, they go away, and then when they come back the next day, it's first come, first served, and that main street is completely different. So the guy that occupied number 8 there, he takes number 8 back, it goes away, and then maybe he shows up the next day to do his business, have his restaurant, maybe he doesn't, but maybe by the time he shows up, he's all the way down here. So what's interesting is that this street is constantly changing. Here's a section through that street to give you a sense, and I should say in the background, when you see, this one's probably a little better, some of this gray back here, it's sort of a figure ground indication of where the dwelling units are. And notice that they're not in an orthogonal or Cartesian, sort of something we would expect potentially in the global north and particularly in the US. But what they start to be is people group their caravans based on family units and family relationships, ethnicities, and more importantly, in formations of informal courtyards. So that's sort of what you're seeing whenever you're seeing this informal gray behind. So a typical section, right, this is the main street. These are these caravans that are unsanctioned as businesses. And then what you see behind them are the caravans in their intended purposes, which is the family unit dwelling. The most private this way, the most public this way, but the gendered layer to this is that only men are occupying this zone, and the women and children now have been really sequestered into this zone, which is an extreme version of what's happening at home because they do have access to outdoor public spaces in Islamic urbanism back in Syria, but they're of quite a different nature. The other thing up top, and I know it's a little bit hard to see because she has a delicate hand in some of her graphics, is how this is male and female children, how the males spend their day and the females spend their day. And the one thing that you can't really see because it's light, it's running across, which is marked as household duties. So it runs across the whole bar. What time of day girls are spent doing household duties, whereas boys do get to come out and support what's happening in the workplace, so they do get access to the public realm. The green bar, the yellow bar is when the school hours are, but like I said, most of them are not, at least half in both are not attending school. So one of the things she did was go back to Syrian vernacular, and you can see a few snippets of that in the top 2 rows. She did much more extensive studies, but became really interested in the courtyard, its role as this semi-public realm, meaning a public space, particularly for women and children. Its relationship to water was both symbolic but also related to duties. But instead of just having her diagram it, she would start to take these and make collages where she would transform it. And how can you transform the courtyard in a more contemporary notion? The bottom row is just showing her trying to document what are the materials that are of use in this camp such that she can reuse them herself. All right, so this is starting to move into how she's intervening. And you'll see those same numbers and kind of orient. She wants to add these layers. She wants to basically do 2 things. Oh, and by the way, the street is called the Champs-Élysées by the refugees. That's how they named that Carta Decimalis. And this is sort of a flattened, in the medieval style, elevation. So she wants to take the caravans, which are these gray boxes, we want to call this a section or elevation. They come in and out, and she wants to create a superstructure, some type of infrastructure that then you can plug into and I'm going to show you in a second what happens with those, to make a more robust realm. The reason she's elevating them is that the structure would stay, but that way the caravans can still come and go, as is the practice. But the permanent part, that colored realm, is now going to be a semi-covered realm for women and children. That was part of the Islamic infrastructure that they left that was permanent, but now is not being provided in this temporary setting. I asked her, well, what's going to happen up there, and how are you going to figure that out? And so she and I decided that I asked her to basically take a series of verbs, and she studied those verbs. She made little watercolors. She'd make a little model, and she'd do a collage drawing of each verb. What you're seeing here from left to right is napping, drawing, and watching. Trying to imagine what children would do in those little naughty spaces. Naughty not being the English word. She calls them naughties, naughty al atfal, which for her, the definition was children's clubs. So I'll be calling them naughties, naughty al atfal. So for her, these start to operate around a specific verb of what children might do, and engage in the materials that are available on the camp, and use the unit of the caravan as her defining dimension. And these from left to right are jumping, eating, climbing, and chatting. Right? How can you get a variety of spaces? And these little icons down here mean in order to engage in jumping, you actually need 2 units of a caravan spatially in order to achieve that. Here are some elevations of how this starts to emerge. So the yellow is that infrastructure that she's going to place in there. What it also does is create a colonnade space where now if you go purchase something from one of the commercial caravans below, you actually now have a place to sit and have your tea or have something to drink. In other words, you're starting to create a true public realm within the naughties, the children's clubs, showing up above. This one is napping, and then you can see a plan detail here and sort of this little suggestion here, so that the kids can start to manipulate these particular elements. In this case, these are these turning screens so that as they want to adjust the light, right, to make it darker when they're napping, depending on the orientation of the sun, or open it up as they're waking up. The other thing I should say is that these are, she calls her architectural screens, again looking at Islamic urbanism and the way in which it's not like a facade that we think of in the Italian sense, but there are a whole series of screens that happen in Islamic architecture. She wanted to play on that and make it contemporary. This one is, I forget the verb, but it's drawing. This one's drawing, so it's related to art. And you can see here, this is again as in plan, these triangles you could draw on each one, but then the kids get to turn them around. So depending on what the drawings are, it ends up sort of as this mashup that again gets telegraphed to the street below. Also in Walter Hood's style, I know you can't read them, but she wrote little stories about what would be happening on the action of the street, the types of businesses. And anytime you see this red, that's a stair portal that is getting you up onto that second story elevation. So you can see she's imagining them fade. The other thing I should say is that she wanted the refugee, this is a kit of parts, and then ultimately the refugees decide what are the verb, what screens do they want going up, and insert the ones that they want in these modules to create mapping or drawing. This next one, oh yeah, that's this one's interesting. Not all were what we would say sort of positive spaces, but spaces are necessary. This one's called crying. So it becomes a more dark, personal, intimate space because kids are dealing with a lot of trauma in this condition. And I think this one was the chatting space in spring. So she's imagining that as people become engaged, that this thing becomes basically viral. The architect provides the infrastructure. The infrastructure also included utilities that include access to water and electricity, which right now are run by camp leaders in a system of bribes. So you might have access to electricity or water, but you also might not, depending on your relationship and your ability to bribe. So she wanted this infrastructure to also, like the well in the courtyard, symbolically to provide utilities to everyone in a more equal access way. You can see, again, how this is starting to develop. Here's a section. So these things aren't flat. It's not just like a U.S. Western false front. That this structure goes back fairly deep, right? This is our Carter de Humanis, the Champs-Élysées, that the Naughties would go back pretty far. But also in that original section, right, of the Caravans being the most private, that there would be some insertions of ones in between the traditionally male space and the domicile, some public spaces for women as well, to be able to leave their caravans and socialize and not be in those spaces. Her idea is that right now it is quite dangerous for both children and women to leave their caravans and go anywhere, that there are, this is her diagram of what she considers to be the safe spaces in the camp, which are not that many. And that when we get down here, that she's hoping that this would be sort of viral, that they would spread throughout, and that it would be safe for women and children to, in fact, leave the caravans, do things like go to school and occupy the entire camp and build a robust public realm. This is the final project. I'll run through this a little bit quickly, so then we can get to questions. So remember, I started with what and whom is being left out and left behind in conventional design processes. This particular student's name is Dustin Buzzard, and the title of his thesis was Painting the Town Pink. And he was really interested in two things: identifying the forgotten assets and infrastructure of the city, and two, revealing community actors and stakeholders currently at the margins, with a focus on queer cultural rituals. And I should note that, again, at the top, queering praxis is my term, or the way in which I understand Dustin's thesis. And I want to stipulate how I use the term queer, which is not about specific people's identities or sexuality. Queer is used in the broader notion of questioning and destabilizing norms and orthodoxies, things that we've assumed are just natural or normal. Queering it means we're challenging what does that actually mean and what are our practices. His project involves actually 4 little mini projects, so I'll try and run through them quickly. They involved a philosophy of the small, adaptive reuse of infrastructures that lay fallow, a notion of social production, and the notion that the city is not about community, because community conveys notions of homogeneity and shared values, but that the city should be a place of difference, and that that is actually a good thing. So the first one is Cruise the Park. This is a historic park. What's interesting about it, it was established about the same time as Portland itself as a pair. This particular park was for men only, and then there was a separate park that was for women and children only. It remained that way in the books until the 1990s. Not clear why that took them so long to change out. Obviously, the police were not enforcing that, but they did enforce it up until about the 70s. So that's interesting fact number one. Also, number two, this is the park that's Occupy Portland Park. So that you would have seen images of that. But outside of Occupy Portland, I would call this the unoccupied park. Any time of day you go by it, it's usually empty. It's sort of one of these 19th century visual parks that you look at, nature is beautiful, but no one really occupies it and does anything there. So Dustin was interested in inserting a lighting structure, which you see in the previous one in all orange, but that's really not the intent. A lighting structure within the park that would be connected to an app, so that when you go to the park, so you wanted to merge sort of how our social productions have become online, therefore they've been rendered invisible, right? That if you want to meet someone and do something with that person, whether it's go play ultimate frisbee, share your love of pork bellies, or engage in a sexual activity, any of those things. You do it online, it's invisible, it remains invisible, you might meet someone in a cafe, but nobody else knows what you're doing. But could we activate the park by, you would have an app, you would code it, so green meant I like ultimate frisbee, that you would know to go to the green light in the park for the person you met for ultimate frisbee on, through the online app. So that you would get all sorts of interesting people coming to the park, meeting, interacting with each other, that these individual structures would also serve as a free Wi-Fi portal. There are a lot of indigenous and low-income people in Portland who don't have access to Wi-Fi, so that in general, if you came to the park, you would have access to free Wi-Fi, and that they would also be utility poles. So if I wanted to plug in my device, because my battery is almost empty, that I could go and hang out in the park and plug it in. What he was playing off of, as you see in this collage in the upper yellow corner, was a mid-20th century coding of how gay men might meet. So depending on the color of bandana that you wore or put in your back pocket, indicated a different activity that you might want to do if you were trying to meet someone. So this is what we're talking about, sort of taking queer culture and then extending it into a place of difference for all, right? That the red bandana might mean you want to engage one activity, so that's the color coding aspect, to meet someone. But for him, it's trying to expand that. How do you take an aspect, historical aspect of queer culture, and now manipulate it into a design idea that becomes a plural space, that all sorts of people are going there. It's not about creating a gay park, but taking an aspect of gay culture and making it now an embedded part of a design process and method. Project number 2, Lock Your Junk. His title. Pretty clever about some of these. So this one aims to reuse a derelict bus stop and turn it into a mini community center. So how do you understand a bus stop as a community center? The site, just to sort of orient you, this pink triangle was known as the Gay Triangle in Portland in the 1960s and 1970s. Contained mainly bars and bathhouses. His particular site, this sort of dilapidated bus stop, is that little pink slash right there. The other thing that I would add is that when he started his thesis project, he didn't know he started it, because he just came to my office and said, how come there's no gay neighborhood in Portland? And I said, that's a thesis. Right? So it is. And so I said, well, I don't know, I've only lived here 2 years, let's figure it out. And so he started doing some historical research, and that's when he found out there was something called the Gay Triangle, but people weren't living there, they were going there to engage in social activities. So he finds this derelict bus stop and becomes interested in how does that become a community center for all. The other thing he wanted to play on was the notion of the bathhouse, since in fact there had been one on that site. And I know it's a little bit hard to read, but you can probably see right next to the bus stop slash, it's just a big parking lot, right? The things that we do to cities that we don't like. So since there used to historically be a bathhouse on the site, he was interested in playing on notions of exposure, visibility, and invisibility that are part of the history of the gay movement, and in particular from the infrastructure of the baths. So we thought, well, the elevation for my bus stop will then have a series of cutouts, but cutouts that aren't about the visual gaze, but about highlighting different parts of someone's body while they're occupying the community center bus stop. The blue also represents, that you see in the little diagram, we wanted to provide a wall of lockers, so that if you're downtown, you're carrying lots of stuff, you can put your stuff in the locker, again, akin to being in the bathhouse, but this is more about that urban experience. You want a safe place to put your stuff. Again, this part of downtown also has a lot of homeless people and a lot of runaway teens. So where's our safe place where you can secure your things as you want to be part of urbanism, whether you're homeless or whether you're a mom carrying too many diapers? Speaking from personal experience, I'd love to have a place like that. So here's his collage where he brings them together. The sort of facade moment of it is a series of those round metal circles that are usually attached to keys when you go to lock a locker. But for him also evoked the notion of the disco era when the Gay Triangle was in its heyday. Right, so sort of playing on how do we get at this issue of beauty or the aesthetics, playing on these sort of deeper rituals and issues. Portland's most famous queer face, Darcel, came out in 1969 when Walter Cole transitioned to a drag queen. In 1970, he opened Darcel's, which is a really popular drag review today, and in fact is the oldest operating one on the West Coast because Pinocchio's closed in San Francisco all the way back in 1999. For this intervention, he wanted, well, I asked him gently to rethink the really popular notion of the parklet, which it's really taken off on the West Coast. So how does he adapt the right-of-way, the city right-of-way in front of Darcel's? And just to orient you again, When Darcel was established in 1970, heyday of the Gay Triangle, he's just north of it. The Gay Triangle technically was everything south of Burnside, but Darcel's just. So what is he going to do in this parklet? Well, I asked him gently to read Wortham Galvin over and over again until he finally did. And what he wanted to do was take the back of house. Wortham Galvin was a sociologist who talks about sort of the drama of the relationship between back of house and front of house. Take the back of house transformation of Darcel into a drag queen and bring it into the front of house, bring it into the parklet. So that notion of primping, of vanity, from queer culture, the transformation into drag, which normally you don't get to see, becomes the activity of the parklet. But in this case, it's not about the performers in Darcel's coming out and making themselves up, going back in, although there's some of them in you would imagine would do this, but also about the people standing in line, getting tickets, anyone occupying this particular area, that it would start to become a place where one could play on that private moment of checking yourself and what do you look like and who are you, and making it part of the public realm, sort of engaging the street in that relationship. So we used mirrors sort of every size as a spectacle. At his thesis, he actually did a full-scale mock-up of part of it. What would these mirrors look like? That there would be this permanent red carpet rolled out from Darcel's into the parklet itself. That would lead you to a diachromatic mirror, which would have shifting and alternating fragments of colored reflective glass, so that you would really engage in the issue of image and perception. I really wanted to highlight those notions. Once again, notions of publicness and privacy are conflated as the act of transformation into drag is moved from an invisible and unknowable realm to a publicly shared one. And here's the final mini project, and Justin called this one Frozen Kisses. And this project starts by looking at two derelict public bathrooms at the end of North Park blocks that have been shuttered for a couple of decades. And what was interesting about it, and I said, why are you interested in this besides the obvious, and I'll show you in a second. So if the location of this, of these two derelict public bathrooms are within the Gay Triangle. This is Burnside, so we're just south of it. It is also, Burnside is where the Gay Pride Parade happens every year. So I thought those were the reasons, but he said actually before they closed, that was his grandmother's job, was to clean those bathrooms. So he had sort of this weird sort of relationship about knowing about them, having been in them, also seeing their decline. His choice to adaptively reuse these artifacts was based not only on their discarded condition, his grandmother, but also on the historical role of the tea room as a site of sexual encounters supported by the infrastructures of public restrooms and transit centers in the early and mid-20th centuries. If the tea room represented a public place where private acts took place, and a place where the invisibility of gay life was made visible to other men, then Frozen Kisses seeks to amplify gestures of intimacy by all people. So what do we mean by that? So what Dustin decided to do, he took the two buildings, here's sort of the diagram, he wanted to whitewash them, and then on the inside just sort of cleared it all out and created a structure that would be a gallery. And then inserts a series of photo booths so that you can go in, do whatever you want to do in the photo booth, and then if you choose, you can hang your photo on the gallery inside. The other thing that you can choose to do, he created a mini public urban space that has a digital screen. You can also upload your photo to the digital screen. So again, that's all options. You can go to the photo booth and not share your photos, but you can also share them as you desire. Frozen Kisses reclaims a space of police oppression and sexual suppression, and gives user the choice of making visible what is often the invisible nature of relationships between different people. By transforming a space that has been culturally ingrained as a site of disgust, because again, these bathrooms have been associated with drugs, prostitution, and gay action, Frozen Kisses affirms that there are others who are as different as one might feel, and that you have relationships with all sorts of people, and that the queering of adaptive reuse here alters a forsaken infrastructure into a welcomed one. I want to just say a few final comments. In asserting the importance of a critical pedagogy, so obviously I've shown you student projects that have a lot to do with my relationship with students and my role as a teacher. The importance of a critical pedagogy that counters naturalized structures. A man named Peter McLaren has said, quote, "Mainstream pedagogy simply produces those forms of subjectivity preferred by the dominant culture, domesticating, pacifying, and deracinating agency, harmonizing a world of disjuncture and incongruity, and smoothing the unruly features of daily existence. At the same time, students' opinions are rationalized and accommodated to the existing regimes of truth instead of thinking of new ones." Acknowledging the stasis of verb-based pedagogy seeks to allow students to critically question the way things are and replace them with the way things might be. It supports a co-production of place that subverts who is it that really makes the built environment and who occupies it, from one as static giver, meaning the architect as giver, and the user as receiver, into a conflation of those roles that are back and forth and more fluid. A verb-based pedagogy allows for students to transform from sole author architect to a mediator of an adaptive built environment wherein reality is understood as in process. So you're not providing an architectural product, you're providing a process, acknowledging that the built environment will in fact continue to change. I want students to grapple with the relationship between the designer and the user of the design, and to challenge that those are even two separate categories. So I want to leave you with a few questions. I don't have answers to these, but I think they need to be asked. If verb-based architectures represent a paradigm shift, then what is the role of the 21st century architect? Because that's who you are. And what should your role be? How do new modes of agency and making provide alternative modes for issues of difference and identity to arise from what has been previously naturalized as architectural practice? How does the verb and a more complex notion of design agency and making offer alternatives, open possibilities, and challenge normative relationships between who gets to make place and who gets to occupy? Thank you.